Let me tell you about the trial blade of Kethvon, because apparently nobody in this galaxy learns anything until it's too late to be smug about it anymore. For 11,000 years, give or take a few centuries, nobody bothered counting because who's got the time, the blade sat in its little marble cradle and did exactly one job. You picked it up. You said your piece. It glowed gold if you were worthy of a seat among the ascendant species, and it glowed red if you weren't, and then everyone went home either celebrating or quietly updating their species obituary. Simple. Elegant. Boring, if you want my honest opinion, which nobody ever does. The thing about ancient and infallible relics, though, is that, infallible, is just a fancy word for, hasn't met the right idiot yet. And on the day this story happens, the galaxy finally introduced the blade to humanity. Buckle up. The ceremony was held in the Hall of Vesserai, a marble amphitheater built by a species so pleased with their own aesthetic sense that they'd carved a monument to formal judgment out of stone that literally glittered when you walked past it, just in case you forgot for 1 second how important everyone in the room was. Rows of alien nobility sat in tiered seating shaped like the inside of a seashell, all silk and ceremonial collars and the specific kind of patience that rich people have when they're pretending to be humble about attending an event beneath their station. At the center of it all stood Lord Vesserai himself, a tall, silver-skinned dignitary whose entire personality could be summarized as disappointed uncle at a wedding. He had presided over 11 trials in his long life. 11 species had come through this hall to prove themselves worthy of joining the interstellar community properly, with voting rights and trade privileges and the ability to complain at summits. Vesserai had watched all 11, judged all 11, and privately decided he already knew how the 12th would go before it started, because humans, frankly, had a reputation. That reputation had preceded them by several years and roughly 400 embarrassing diplomatic incidents. So when the shuttle carrying humanity's official ambassador failed to arrive because, and I want to stress this really happened, the ambassador overslept, the humans did what humans do when faced with an impossible deadline. They panicked for 6 minutes, argued for 4, and then shoved the nearest available person out the door. That person was Priya Okonkwo Reyes, a station maintenance engineer who had been on her way to fix a coolant leak in Deck 7 and instead found herself standing in a shuttle bay being handed a formal robe 2 sizes too big and a laminated card that said, in large friendly letters, "Do not mention the incident with the moon." She did not know what incident. Nobody would tell her. This detail will not matter for the rest of the story, but I'm including it because it's exactly the kind of thing that happens to humans, and also because somebody, somewhere, is still furious about that moon. Priya arrived at the Hall of Vesserai 40 minutes late, robe crooked, hair escaping whatever bun she'd attempted that morning, holding a half-eaten protein bar because nobody had told her the ceremony would eat into her lunch. The assembled nobility looked at her the way you'd look at a smudge on an otherwise pristine window. "This," Lord Vesserai said, in the tone of a man already composing his post-ceremony report, "is humanity's representative?" "Apparently," Priya said, and finished her protein bar. Somewhere in the back rows, a junior archivist named Theskor, small, feathered, permanently ink-stained from a career spent transcribing records nobody read, leaned forward in his seat with the specific delight of someone who suspects they are about to witness something worth writing down. He had no idea. The ritual, as explained to Priya in rushed, badly translated bursts by an anxious protocol officer backstage, worked like this. The candidate approached the pedestal. The candidate lifted the blade. The candidate spoke a truth about their people, out loud, in front of everyone, and the sword, an artifact of unknowable ancient make, forged by a civilization so old their name had been lost even to the archives, would render judgment. Gold for worthy. Red for doomed. It had done this 11 times before, and 11 times it had been right, according to the people who'd built an entire religion around never questioning it. To demonstrate, they showed her a recording of the previous trial, a delegate from the Yurthani collective, poised, radiant, draped in ceremonial armor that had clearly been ironed by someone with a personal vendetta against wrinkles. She lifted the blade with both hands, spoke a single elegant sentence about her people's unity and sacrifice, and the sword lit up gold so bright it looked like a small sun had briefly relocated to the amphitheater. Applause. Tears. A standing ovation. Very moving, genuinely, if you like that sort of thing. Priya watched the recording, chewing the last corner of her protein bar wrapper because apparently she'd eaten the actual bar without noticing, and said, "Okay. So I just pick it up and say something." "You must speak with reverence," the protocol officer said. "You must hold it with both hands, at the level of your heart, Anne." "Got it," Priya said, and walked out onto the floor before he could finish the sentence, because there is nothing in the universe more terrifying to a nervous bureaucrat than a human who thinks they've already got it. The amphitheater fell into that specific hush reserved for moments everyone secretly hopes will go badly, because watching dignity collapse in real time is, let's be honest, everyone's favorite spectator sport. Priya reached the pedestal. The blade sat there in its cradle, an unremarkable-looking length of dark metal with none of the ornamentation you'd expect from something 11,000 years old and worshipped by 6 species. She picked it up the way you'd pick up a wrench you weren't sure was the right size. She turned it over once. "Huh," she said, to the entire assembled nobility of the region, "this grip is terrible. Whoever designed this clearly never held it for more than 10 seconds. Lord Vesarai's expression did something complicated and unpleasant. "You are holding the single most sacred object in 6-star systems," he said. "Sure," Priya said, adjusting her grip again, "and it's still ergonomically terrible. There's no reason the balance point should be this far forward. You'd get wrist fatigue in about 90 seconds if you actually had to fight with this thing." She squinted at the hilt. "Can I adjust this?" "No," said several priests at once, in the tone of people watching someone try to rearrange furniture in a cathedral. "Fine," Priya said, entirely unbothered, and held the blade up at roughly heart height, which for her was somewhat lower than the Yurthani delegate's ceremonial pose, mostly because Priya is not particularly tall and nobody had adjusted the pedestal for human proportions, which, again, nobody had planned this ceremony around a human showing up in the first place. "Speak your truth," the protocol officer whispered urgently from the wings. Priya thought about it for exactly 2 seconds, which is apparently the correct amount of time to think before saying something that breaks an 11,000-year streak. "We're a mess," she said. "We fight each other constantly, we've made some genuinely terrible decisions, we blew up part of our own moon once for reasons I'm apparently not allowed to discuss, and half of us can't agree on anything. But when something breaks, somebody fixes it, and when someone falls, somebody else picks them up, even people who hate each other, even when it doesn't make sense. That's it. That's the whole truth. We're a disaster that keeps showing up anyway." Silence. The blade did not glow gold. The blade did not glow red. The blade did nothing whatsoever. The faint ambient shimmer it had held for 11,000 years, the low ceremonial glow that priests described in hushed reverent tones as the blade's breath, simply switched off, like someone had unplugged a very old, very expensive lamp. For a full 5 seconds, nobody in the hall of Vesarai made a sound. Then everyone made every sound at once. "I want you to understand something about ancient sacred orders. They are extremely good at ceremony and extremely bad at improvisation. 11,000 years of the blade behaving exactly one of 2 ways had produced an entire priesthood that had never once rehearsed for option 3, because option 3 had never been considered a real possibility, the same way nobody keeps a fire extinguisher next to the ocean." Priests scrambled. Nobles stood up out of their seats, robes rustling like a startled flock of very wealthy birds. Somewhere near the back, someone actually screamed, briefly, before remembering they were nobility and stopping themselves out of embarrassment. Lord Vesarai's face had gone the particular shade of gray that silver-skinned aliens apparently turn when their entire worldview develops a crack in it. "That is not possible," he said. "Well," Priya said, still holding the sword, looking at it with the mild irritation of someone whose tool had stopped working mid-task, "it's doing it, so." The blade does not fail, Veserai said, louder now, more for the benefit of the panicking assembly than for Priya. In 11,000 years the blade has never failed to render judgment. It cannot simply stop. Maybe it needs new batteries, Priya said. Nobody laughed. I laughed. You're allowed to laugh. It's fine. Here is where the story would normally slow down and let the panic build for dramatic effect, and if you want that experience, please imagine roughly 10 minutes of aliens shouting old words at a sword that was, and remains, extremely unbothered by shouting. But since we've got a word count and better things to do, let's cut to the part where somebody actually useful shows up. That somebody was Theskor, the small feathered archivist from the back row, who had spent his entire unglamorous career transcribing dusty accounts of the Blade's previous judgments into records nobody read, and who therefore knew more about the actual mechanics of the thing than every panicking noble in the building combined. He pushed his way to the front while three priests argued about whether this was an omen, a curse, or possibly grounds for a lawsuit, and knelt beside the pedestal, peering at the dark blade with the specific fascination of a man who has just realized his boring job is about to become extremely interesting. It's not broken, he said. Everyone else seems to think it's broken, Priya said. Everyone else thinks in two categories, Theskor said, not looking up. Worthy. Doomed. Gold. Red. The blade was built to measure a species against those two outcomes, because every species it has ever judged fit neatly into one or the other. Conquerors versus builders. Unity versus collapse. Purity versus corruption. The blade reads the truth a candidate speaks and compares it against a pattern. Every pattern it has ever seen has had an answer. And mine didn't? Priya asked. Yours, Theskor said, straightening up and looking at her with an expression that on a human would have been a grin, doesn't have a category yet. This, if you're wondering, is the part of the story where I stop making fun of humans for a second, because I promised sarcasm, not dishonesty, and this next bit is worth being honest about. See, every species that had ever stood in that hall before Priya had a clean story. The Yurthani were unified, disciplined, elegant, and their truth reflected that, one people, one purpose, easy to measure, easy to judge. Every species the blade had ever tested had, in its own way, resolved its contradictions before showing up. They arrived as finished thoughts. Humanity showed up as a rough draft with coffee stains on it. We fight wars and then send the same people who were fighting to rebuild what got broken. We colonize impulsively and apologize globally, often in the same century, occasionally in the same decade, sometimes, embarrassingly, in the same government administration. We build weapons capable of ending everything and then spend generations arguing about whether to use them, mostly deciding not to, which honestly should count for something. We are, at the exact same time, the most self-destructive and the most self-sacrificing species most of this galaxy has ever measured, and there had simply never been a slot in the blade's ancient sorting algorithm for, chaotic, contradictory, and still somehow showing up to help. The blade wasn't malfunctioning. It was doing long division with a species that refused to be a whole number. So it's confused, Priya said. It's thinking, Theskor said. Possibly for the first time in its existence. Most candidates give it an answer key. You gave it a question. Lord Veserai, who had been listening to this exchange with the expression of a man watching his retirement plans catch fire, cleared his throat loudly enough to reassert his presence. This is unacceptable, he said. The trial requires a verdict. We cannot simply admit an entire species on the basis of a broken artifact and a shrug. I didn't shrug, Priya said. I told the truth. If your sword can't handle the truth, that's kind of a design flaw, no offense. You dare. I dare a lot of things, apparently, Priya said. It's been that kind of day. Now, at this point in most versions of this story, there would be a dramatic pause, a rising orchestral swell, maybe a single beam of light cutting through stained glass at exactly the right moment. What actually happened was considerably less cinematic and, honestly, more human, which I think is the entire point. While the priests argued and the nobility fretted and Lord Vesserai worked himself into a truly impressive state of formal outrage, a sound cut through the chamber, a low electrical whine, followed by a flicker in the overhead lighting array along the eastern wall of the amphitheater. One of the ancient power conduits feeding the hall's lighting, built by the same civilization that built everything else in this overdesigned marble nightmare, had started to fail, sparking dangerously near a support column, because apparently nobody had done maintenance on this building in several centuries either, on account of everyone being very busy being important. Nobody noticed except Priya, because nobody else in that room had spent the last decade of their life responsible for keeping a space station's guts from catching fire. She was moving before she'd finished deciding to move, sword still in one hand, because putting it down apparently hadn't occurred to her either. She crossed to the failing conduit, popped the maintenance panel with the heel of her palm in a motion so practiced it barely registered as effort, took one look at the sparking coupling, and swore under her breath in a way that needs no translation across any species. "Someone get me an insulated clamp," she said, to nobody in particular, already reaching into the panel with her free hand. "You cannot simply," a priest began. "This whole wall is about to arc into that column and take out the support strut," Priya said, not looking up, "and then everyone in the first 6 rows is going to have a significantly worse day than me finding out your sword doesn't like my personality. So either hand me a clamp or get out of my light." Someone, somewhere, produced a clamp. I genuinely don't know who. History, in its infinite unhelpfulness, does not record it. What history does record is that Priya Okonkwo Reyes, still robed in an ill-fitting ceremonial garment, still holding an 11,000-year-old sacred artifact in one hand because nobody had told her where to put it down, spent the next 90 seconds fixing a 2,000-year-old power conduit with her free hand, muttering the entire time about substandard wiring and whoever designed this building clearly not having to be the one who maintained it. She did this the way you fix things when fixing things is just what you do. Not for applause. Not for the trial. Not because anyone asked. Because something was broken and she was standing right there and it would have bothered her more to walk away than to fix it. The conduit stabilized with a soft click and a final apologetic spark. Priya closed the panel, wiped her hand on her robe, which I imagine did absolutely nothing for the robe, and turned back toward the pedestal like nothing had happened. That is when the blade woke up. It didn't glow gold. It didn't glow red. Light bled up from the metal in a color that, and I want to be very clear about this, did not exist in the recorded spectrum of the blade's 11 previous judgments, a shifting hue somewhere between the gold of triumph and something colder and stranger, like dawn deciding it couldn't commit to a single shade. The light pulsed once, twice, then settled into a steady glow that seemed, if a sword can seem anything, faintly pleased with itself. Theskor made a sound that in his species meant something close to a gasp, except happier. "It found the answer," he said. "It wasn't looking at what you said. It was waiting to see what you'd do." "I just fixed a wire," Priya said, staring at the sword in her hand like it had personally inconvenienced her. "You fixed a wire nobody asked you to fix, mid-ceremony, without stopping to consider whether it was your job," Theskor said. "Unasked, unglamorous, and useful. That's the pattern, isn't it? Not unity. Not conquest. Just, showing up. Fixing what's broken because you can't stand watching it stay broken. That's your truth. The blade just needed to see it, not hear it." Lord Vesserai stared at the new light with an expression that suggested his entire worldview was undergoing unscheduled maintenance of its own. "What does that color mean?" he demanded. "Gold is admission. Red is rejection. What is that?" "I don't know," Theskor said, delighted rather than horrified, which tells you a lot about the difference between an archivist and a bureaucrat. "There's never been a third color. We'll have to write a new record." Which is, if you think about it, the single funniest possible outcome for an 11,000-year-old infallible sacred trial, not that it rejected humanity, not that it accepted humanity, but that humanity broke its filing system so thoroughly that an entire ancient religious order had to go invent new paperwork. The verdict, once the priest stopped arguing long enough to agree on wording, came down to this: the blade had not judged humanity worthy or doomed, because those were the wrong questions to ask about a species like this one. It had instead done something it had never done in 11,000 years of ceremonial service. It had recognized something new, logged it, and quietly, without fanfare, made room for it. Humanity was granted provisional standing among the ascendant species, not on the old terms of gold and red, worthy and doomed, but under an entirely new designation that the priesthood would spend the next several decades arguing about how to define. Which, frankly, felt about right. Some things shouldn't be settled in an afternoon. Priya set the sword back in its cradle with roughly the same ceremony she'd have used setting down a wrench, looked at Lord Vesserai, who was still processing several centuries of theological certainty crumbling in real time, and said, "So are we done?" Because I was on my lunch break when they grabbed me, and there's still a coolant leak on Deck 7 with my name on it. Vesserai, to his credit, did not have a response prepared for that, because nothing in 11,000 years of protocol had prepared him for a species whose representative treated cosmic judgment and a broken pipe as roughly equal priorities. "You may go," he finally managed. "Great," Priya said, and left, still in the too large robe, still smelling faintly of ozone from the conduit, already thinking about coolant pressure rather than the fact that she had just single-handedly rewritten the operating logic of the oldest trial in 6-star systems. So here's where I'd normally wrap this up with something profound about destiny, but let's be honest with each other instead. Humanity didn't pass some grand cosmic exam that day. We didn't prove we were worthy in the way anyone expected, and we definitely didn't get rejected, because apparently we're too complicated to fail cleanly at anything, including failing. What actually happened is that an ancient, infallible, unquestionable sacred relic took one look at us, tried to sort us into 11,000 years of tidy categories, and just quietly gave up and made a new one. Not because we were better than everyone who came before. Because we didn't fit, and instead of forcing us to, the universe, for once, decided to update its own rulebook to make room. Somewhere in that archive, there's now a category with exactly one entry in it, and it's us, and the description, if Theskor ever finishes writing it, will probably just say something like, "shows up anyway." I'd call that a fair summary. Messy, unglamorous, mildly infuriating to the people trying to categorize us, and somehow still the thing that got us in the door. Priya, for the record, got back to her coolant leak 40 minutes late and never mentioned the ceremony again unless someone specifically asked, at which point she'd shrug and say the sword had a bad grip and leave it at that. Which, honestly, might be the most human ending this story could possibly have.